Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you this morning. I caught COVID at the last moment and was unable to travel. So I apologize for that. At the behest of Harold, and I'm sending a virtual presentation, which I hope is going to work. My name is Richard Vine, just so that you can put a name to a face. That's what I look like. And I'm going to be presenting today on what I describe as the business of conservation. And I'm going to focus on the School for Wildlife Conservation, which is a faculty of the African Leadership University. And I'll talk about that more in a second or two. Um, Before I do that, I just want to give you a little bit of context about my background and how I came into the School for Wildlife Conservation and what I believe that school can do for the future of wildlife conservation across Africa. So I came to Old Pejeta around about 25 years ago when it was a defunct ranch. Um, together with others in the Laikipia landscape, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that landscape. We focused on recovery of the black rhino in particular, but also obviously conservation of many other species. And we're proud of our achievements. At the time when we started, there were probably only around about 300 rhinos left in Kenya. By the time I left Old Pejeta, and this graph is a little bit dated, there were 150 odd black rhinos on that property. Kenya's black rhino population has risen to just short of 1,000 individuals, and this species is, I wouldn't go so far as to say thriving, but it's certainly doing much better in Kenya than it has for many years. Um, but when we got involved in rhinos, we knew at the very beginning that, in fact, many people warned us, don't do it because it's risky. Number one, and number two, looking after rhinos, given all of the security that you have to provide, is enormously expensive. So rather concentrate on just normal wildlife, a little bit of tourism, and give yourselves an easy life. But we decided not to do that. But we did then get to thinking about how we were going to always be in a position to pay for the costs of looking after rhinos um, without being overly dependent upon donors, and also recognizing the fact that tourism, as you will all know, is a very fickle business, and also that the costs of conservation are largely fixed. So we came up with this idea, which at the time was revolutionary. We called it the integrated approach to conservation land management. It started with the integration of cattle and wildlife. There were many people in the landscape who told us we were stupid and foolish and that this was never going to work. That tourists coming to wildlife areas wouldn't pay to come to places where they saw cattle, and similarly, the cattle would never make money in the face of competition from wildlife, from a predation and from a competition for forage and from a disease perspective. But they were missing the point. The point is that by putting the two together, we created a system which, whilst it had compromises on both sides of the equation. I.e., there were probably some tourists who didn't come because they didn't want to see cattle, or our cattle were less productive than they otherwise would have been in the face of competition from wildlife. Overall, with those two systems put together, notwithstanding the compromises on both sides of the equation, we can easily demonstrate now that we have become much more profitable than the either or situation, and more importantly, we have also become more productive, not only in terms of what we produce from the land, but also in terms of our ability to pay taxes, important in countries such as Kenya, but most importantly, our ability to employ people, where the vast majority of the population has no access to formal job opportunities. So for us, it's been an enormous success. It is now copied across large swathes of certainly Kenya and increasingly other parts of Africa, and it's a form of land use that secures conservation space by taking a commercial approach, where whilst biodiversity is important, it's not considered to be absolutely sacrosanct, and that we have to attend to the needs of people and to the financial needs of the institution at the same time. So, an illustration of how that has helped us is shown by this map here, which won't mean anything to any of you, but Mutara Conservancy, the Mutara Ranch, sits immediately to the north of Old Pejeta and still represents a very important corridor, wildlife corridor for us as a conservancy to retain our connectivity to the greater Laikipia ecosystem. Without that corridor, we would become an island and we would be nothing more than a game reserve, intensively managed and fully fenced. In order to get the government, who are the owners of ADC, to provide us with land to establish that corridor, if we had gone to them and said, look, we need you to get rid of all of your cattle, notwithstanding the fact that you're the national stud for the country, we want you to get rid of all your cattle because we want you to make space for the movement and for the movement of wildlife to keep us linked to a bigger ecosystem. If we'd gone with that approach, they would have laughed at us. Instead, with our system, we were able to go to the government and say, look, we've got a new model here, which means you can keep your cattle. In fact, it might be possible for you to make them more productive in our system. We can, at the same time, make space for biodiversity and wildlife and the maintenance thereof, and at the same time, create something of a platform for possible revenue streams from tourism as we develop this integrated land use approach on your land. When we went with that, it was much easier for government to allow us to do it, recognizing the importance of the corridor, but recognizing that they could establish the corridor without compromising the profitability and productivity of the ranch over which they had jurisdiction. So in effect, by reducing the opportunity costs, and that's essentially what we're doing in this system, we created a mechanism that allowed us to secure conservation or land that otherwise would have been lost to conservation. Absolutely not in the perfect sense of the word. There were still people there and cattle there, and so it wasn't as pristine as perhaps sort of wildlife aficionados around Africa would like. But nevertheless, at least 90% of the biodiversity was maintained, even as we accommodated other forms of land use. So for us, this is a very important model in modern Africa, and it got us to thinking, what more could we do with our land? So we started a solar company, for example, selling renewable energy to neighboring communities and also renewable services to other conservancies. Again, this was an activity, a commercial activity in our integrated approach that was designed to make money, but was possible without significantly compromising the biodiversity of the Old Pejeta Conservancy. So we're still able to grow our rhinos. We still had some of the biggest populations and population densities of predators recorded in Kenya, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we were able to do this as something else to bring in revenue, to not only feed ourselves and keep ourselves going, but also to begin to do a lot of conservation and community-related work around us in support of the wider landscape. And we went on to develop a residential housing scheme, and there were lots of activities that we created, which in a typical sort of conservation environment would never be considered, because they would be considered to be alien somehow to the notion of conservation being the preservation of biodiversity and wildlife. So we compromise a little in some places to maintain the bigger biodiversity picture. And that, for me, was a really salient lesson in the success of the Old Pejeta Conservancy. And as we thought more and more about it and got more and more commercial in our approach, we began to recognize, obvious things which everybody in the room listening to this will understand. And that is, everybody in the room who has a commercial mindset operating in tourism will understand, which is that, the power of the brand. Most conservation, or a lot of conservation organizations, have incredibly powerful brands, but they never use them, and they don't recognize how powerful they are, and they certainly don't leverage them to bring in resources. And that's sort of what I'm trying to get across. There was a transformation in the way that we went about our conservation, which was very commercial in nature, which resulted in us being profitable, or at least making a surplus that could then be re-injected back into more conservation at greater scale. And for my mind, that is something that needs to happen more and more across the African space, because we cannot simply continue to rely on the largesse of donors or subsidies from cash-strapped governments who have other priorities on their minds. So why is that important? Well, it's important because if we can make conservation space profitable, if we can make conservation profitable, maybe not always, but sometimes, then suddenly we become an investable opportunity. Suddenly we have people banging on our doors saying, we'd like to buy some equity. We'd like to lend you some money. We'd like to make you a destination for our capital, because we know we're going to get a return. If I'd stayed on Old Pejeta, I would have pushed the board to take us down the route of publicly listing on the stock exchange in Kenya. And the reason I could do that, which would have been a great route to raise capital and also to engage with Kenyan people, would only have been premised upon the fact that we were a profitable institution making a return. So, as a route to developing capital and bringing capital into the conservation space, for my mind, that would have been something that we should have considered. So, profitability for me what many of you will understand, I'm sure, is that when you talk to conservationists, they don't talk about profitability. They never talk about profitability. They talk about ecology. They talk about protection. They talk about preservation. But commerce and profitability and return on investment, those are not words which are used in the conservation space. And for the reasons I've tried to explain based on my experience on Old Pejeta, I think that they should be used much more often, and that we should be seeking to transform the conservation space to make it investable. So that brings me to the African Leadership University, ALU, and the School of Wildlife Conservation. The School of Wildlife Conservation is not a school of wildlife conservation in the way that such schools are often perceived. We specialize and focus on what we call the business of conservation, everything that I've just talked about. What we want to do is reverse what is happening on this graph, where produced capital and human capital has been built at the expense, more often than not, of natural capital. So think simply of cutting down forests to make way for agriculture, or you can think of all the examples of how produced capital is coming at the expense of natural capital. As a school, what we want to focus on is methods that allow produced capital necessary for the economic and social development of Africa to be built at the same time, or at least without compromising natural capital. So can we find ways where natural capital and produced capital grow at the same time, instead of one seeming to come always at the expense of the other? So that is what we're all about. That's what the school is all about. And just a quick word on the African Leadership University itself. So it's an incredibly ambitious institution. It was founded by a guy called Fred Swaneker. Its aim is to train and equip the next generation of leadership across Africa. And to do this, it wants to drive down the cost of tertiary education in Africa significantly, by as much as 70%. It's going to do that through a distributed learning model, which I won't talk about right now, but it's not just online. It's much more sophisticated than that. And the idea behind driving down the cost of access to tertiary education is, in so doing, one then makes that kind of education accessible to millions more people than it otherwise would have been available to. And within those millions of people, there are going to be a lot of exceptionally bright people who would easily have qualified to go to university but could never have afforded to do so. So we call it the excellence at scale model. And our ambition, to which we hold ourselves, is to place 3 million Africans in jobs between now and 2035. And to do that, we're going to focus on what are referred to as the 7 grand challenges and the seven grand opportunities of Africa. And the wildlife economy, is seen as a grand opportunity for Africa, a grand economic opportunity for Africa that can create economic opportunity in a manner which doesn't compromise the needs of people, and social requirements. So within that, the School of Wildlife Conservation, we are but one faculty. As I've tried to explain, we want to transform conservation into an economic opportunity. We want to make it something which is seen to be investable. We want it to be something which can be. We want to develop new models that allow the conservation space to become profitable, and we want to do that without the traditional reliance on tourism and hunting. Not to say that either of those two things are necessarily bad, depending on your viewpoint from a hunting perspective. They're necessary and they're critically important going forwards. But are they the only tools that we can deploy to transform the conservation space into something which is more investable and which is growing at the same time as produced capital? The other thing we want to do is influence policy change at the level of government. And particularly improve the way in which policy is implemented across Africa, something which, as I think we will all agree, is sometimes not as good as it could be at the moment. And you might say to me, well, how on earth does one take conservation and make it profitable? Well, I can give you a couple of examples, but actually there's a lot of emerging financial instruments and other tools which we believe, if deployed correctly in the hands of bright people, could transform the fortunes of that space. And the obvious one is carbon. Why is carbon conservation? Why is it important for conservation? Well, that's because carbon and biodiversity are inextricably linked. If you want to sequester carbon, if you want to hold carbon, maintenance of large areas with thriving biodiversity, well-managed rangelands, intact forests, and etc., are going to be fundamentally important. So, as a tool to address the decarbonization of the planet, the maintenance of biodiversity, in other words, conservation, is going to be incredibly important. As we all know, right now, from a carbon perspective, the world is at a tipping point. There's increased government scrutiny and legislation, and that's all going to start to reflect in the commercial world. Sooner or later, your tourism businesses are going to need to demonstrate, at the very least, carbon neutrality. And that's probably going to include the carbon emitted by your clients traveling on jet planes from places like America to get to Africa in the first place. And how are you going to do that? It's incredibly difficult. Well, one of the ways you'll probably do it is by buying what are referred to as verified carbon units, otherwise known as VCUs. Now, those carbon units will be produced by areas which can absorb and sequester carbon, which you can then buy to offset the carbon that you as a business have emitted. And that's going to become a massive market in the future. There's almost no doubt about it. Think of the likes of, I don't know, some of the biggest companies in the world. They can't become carbon neutral. But what they can do is buy carbon units, verified carbon units. And in so doing, what they will be doing is supporting conservation. They'll be supporting those areas which sequester carbon, such as places like Laikipia, where I am from, which is currently looking at a carbon project to produce these VCUs that I'm talking about. And what's interesting is right now the supply of VCUs is much lower than the demand, and that gap between supply and demand is probably going to increase dramatically over the next 10 years. And what that means is the price of VCUs is probably going to increase hugely. So again, there's a massive opportunity for revenue generation into areas of wilderness and biodiversity where these VCUs are being created. And I can give you a practical, real life example. The Northern Rangelands Trust in Kenya has recently been paid across its many different conservancies, which are owned by communities, $13 million for carbon credits that they have created and sold on the carbon markets. And that money is going directly into conservation because it's that conservation which is sequestering the carbon that has enabled the generation of the carbon credits in the first place. So that's just one opportunity. Larry Fink, you've probably heard of Larry Fink, chairman of BlackRock Investments. This is what he said: the next 1,000 unicorns, that's businesses which turn over, privately owned businesses which turn over $1 billion a year. They won't be search engines or social media companies. They'll be sustainable. That word sustainable is important. Scalable innovators, startups that help the world decarbonize. And of course, it won't just be the conservation space. There'll be many other um, um, businesses which come up with ways of helping the world decarbonize. But that's where it's at. This is the next big thing in many people's books. Let me talk just briefly about regenerative agriculture. And again, I can hear you saying, well, what on earth has that got to do with conservation? Well, it's all to do with biodiversity. We are beginning to recognize not only that we're losing biodiversity at an incredibly rapid rate, but that actually agriculture is responsible for a good deal of that loss. Think of herbicides and pesticides applied liberally across the fields of Europe and America, to the point now that Europe's insect populations are reckoned to have decreased by as much as 70% over the last 40 or 50 years. That can't carry on. Those, those insects form a variety of different functions that support us, including pollination of crops, amongst others. And we can't do without insects. Similarly, think of the overfishing across the sea, the oceans of the world. Billions of people depend upon those fisheries. And if we continue as we are now, and this is not really regenerative agriculture, but it's linked, then we're not going to have any fisheries. And then what do? Well, it implies that those fisheries have got to be managed much better. And in order for those fisheries to produce, they need to be biodiverse, because biodiversity is actually what underpins everything. In regenerative agriculture, soil biodiversity is now considered to be the thing that confers fertility upon soil in the absence of artificial fertilizers, produced at great expense from a carbon footprint perspective. Interestingly, livestock are also considered to be fundamentally important, notwithstanding the arguments against livestock from a carbon perspective. But let me not get into that argument. The point I'm trying to make is that increasingly biodiversity, the maintenance of biodiversity, and the ecosystem services that it can provide are being recognized as being more and more important. What do I mean by ecosystem services? The absorption of carbon, making soil fertile, and etc. 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 So biodiversity is actually what underpins most things, and in most people's books, biodiversity is just another word for conservation. The other thing we want to do at the African Leadership University is understand the wildlife economy in Africa as it sits at the moment, and understand what we can do to influence changes in that economy with the development of the people and the tools and the thinking to enable that economy to grow. And how do we define the wildlife economy? Well, I've sort of tried to define it already, but it basically is an economy that uses indigenous wildlife, includes plants, animals, includes marine and terrestrial, as an economic asset to create value that aligns with conservation objectives. In other words, builds natural capital rather than erodes natural capital, and delivers sustainable growth and economic development at the same time. So in order for us to do what we want to do, which is to transform the conservation space, we need to understand the space that we're trying to transform. So right now, we are doing case studies on every single country in Africa. We are trying to understand the wildlife economy in each of those countries. And ultimately, we're going to come up with an investment ranking, which we're going to publish at our Business of Conservation conference every couple of years. And that investment ranking is going to list African countries in order of the efficiency of their management of their wildlife economy and the opportunities that are available therein for investors. So we'll be looking at wildlife assets. We'll be looking at how wildlife and natural resources are managed. We'll be looking at creating an enabling environment to improve things, and an enabling environment to make it easier for investors to come into those countries, particularly if they're interested in investing into the wildlife economy, and et cetera, et cetera. And we've done quite a lot of this now for 3 years. And what's really fascinating about this is that it's attracting a huge amount of attention from big organizations such as the UN and et cetera, but much more importantly, from governments all over Africa. They want to know where they are. They're beginning to recognize the importance of this. They're beginning to understand that the policy environment and the implementation thereof needs to be improved. And overall, they're beginning to understand how important natural capital is. And so, if we can continue down that road, um, with repeated surveys to show progress or not, as the case may be, with the development of a kind of competition between African countries from an investment in the wildlife economy ranking perspective, then we feel that will be important at the same time as keeping us at the cutting edge of what is new new and innovative in the wildlife space. So that's what we're all about. 3 million young Africans into jobs by 2035. A significant portion of them will be conservation students. We are running a master's, an MBA in conservation. It's the first of its kind in the world. Um, the whole focus of the university is to create entrepreneurial leaders focused on missions around the 14 mission areas. Those are the seven grand challenges and the 7 great opportunities of Africa. And to reiterate the point, wildlife conservation and planetary health is seen as a massive opportunity for this continent, provided we can transform the way in which it is approached. So that's what we're all about. Unfortunately, I'm not there to take any questions, but if anybody would like to contact me, Harold Goodwin, who is the convener of this meeting, has my contacts, and I'd be more than willing to network and meet up with anybody who is interested. We're looking for partnerships. You've understood the scale of our ambition. Just to give you an example, we will be looking to place somewhere in the region of 1,000 students in internships that need to be good internships per year. Part of our distributed model is to create mission hubs and learning hubs across the African continent, where students can convene, where they can be mentored, where they have access to internet, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's something that maybe is appealing to some of you in the room. There's a lot that we could talk about. The tourism industry, from our perspective, is of course massively important in the wildlife economy. That will continue to be the case, and we're there to support it, as well as to take the pressure off it to be the only provider of sort of conservation revenue support, as is the case in many African countries. So thank you very much indeed, and I'm hoping that I will hear from some of you in due course. Thank you, and bye.